Conference will now be recorded.
And so now that we're recording, it's really proper that I should stop, and I invite our brother Ron to come forward and to exhort us this morning, please.
Thanks, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. So, as promised, we are continuing our exhortational series on the I Am titles of Jesus. And for those who were at the previous exhortations, we have looked at I am the bread of life, and we have looked at Jesus as I am the light of the world. And now we're going to look at the third of Jesus' sayings in John's Gospel, which is, I am the door. And this is obviously taken from that record in John chapter 10. So looking at John chapter 10, something's really interesting immediately when you look at this parable of Jesus. So Jesus says this parable to the people in John chapter 10, and in verse 6 it says they didn't understand what he was saying. And then he goes to explain it. And the first thing he says in explanation is, I am the door. Now have a think about this, because this is interesting if you really stop and think about Jesus' parable. Would you have made the conclusion from his parable and identified, what he's talking about is he's the door? You wouldn't naturally make that assumption, would you? He talks about he who does not enter the sheepfold through the door by the correct way is a thief or a robber. Interesting words. Thief is the word klepto, where we get kleptomaniac. A robber is more what you might call aggravated robbery. So one's subtle theft and one's more aggravated robbery. So he who enters by another way and climbs in, he's a thief or a robber, and to him the gatekeeper will not open, but the shepherd of the sheep is the one the gatekeeper opens. And he's the good shepherd that calls his sheep by name. So now if you were identifying Jesus, you would say maybe gatekeeper, maybe shepherd, certainly not a thief or robber. But he starts this parable by saying, I'm the door. It's interesting, isn't it? That's not what you would expect in the interpretation in this parable. So Jesus, whoops, pretty far. Let's go back one. I was just about to show you that, doing some advertising there. So this third saying, I am the door or I am the gate, is about this concept of access, the opening, the portal, if you like, is the idea. Something where you would actually come in and out of this space. I am the door or the gate. And interesting enough, Andrew had exactly the same photo that I had of this picture, which is a great picture, which you do a search on the internet and it comes up of this man by the gate. This would be the gatekeeper as opposed to the shepherd. I feel I'm a reasonable expert on doors because for the last 30 years, I've either been manufacturing doors or fixing doors. So I have a lot of knowledge and background on doors, so this is quite a topical subject for me. And when you come to consider looking at a door, you have to assess, first of all, is the door worthy of being fixed? Can it be fixed, or does it need to be replaced? And then there's a lot of questions about what people are looking for from a door. Is it a door that's going to be opened up into a home as an entrance? Is it a door that is going to provide security? What exactly are people looking for in a door? A quick little connection into Darren's Bible class. For those who have been going along to Darren's Bible class, you remember Darren talked about the foreigner or the stranger, and he talked about how that this word was made up of two Hebrew words, gimel and rosh, which is the idea of the foot and the head, and literally it was like the walking man. And the stranger was like the wanderer who was walking. And it's the word which is used where in the Old Testament Jesus cared for the stranger, the alien, the foreigner. He would look after them. Well, what's interesting, the word for a sheepcoat, which is the same word Jesus uses in the Old Testament, it just adds one letter, Dalet, door. The difference between the stranger and the sheepfold is Gadara adds Dalet, the door. Because sheep are wanderers, aren't they? Or you use the phrase, all we like sheep are gone astray. They wander around walking, and sometimes aimlessly, and sometimes lost. So the picture of the stranger wandering is a great picture of the sheep. The sheep coat, the only difference that between the lost sheep or the wandering sheep or the stranger is the door, dalet, the Hebrew word for the door. And I believe that's why Jesus is going to use this connection straight away where he says, I am the door. That's the picture, more like the picture of a sheep coat. It's this idea of creating a protection for the sheep, a protection where the sheep could go to be protected at night from invading animals, from the wolf. But of course, there was a door that was there that had to be guarded and protected. In our previous exhortations, we looked at the different aspect of how the I am titles relate to things in the Old Testament with the tabernacle. And we looked at how the bread related to the table of showbread, and the light related to the candlestick, or even the pillar of fire, which guided and led them. When it comes to this concept of the door, this was something that was very familiar with the entrance to the tabernacle. Because when you came to the tabernacle door, you brought your lamb, your sacrifice. You could never come empty-handed. You always had to bring something to the door. There was an admission price to come to the tabernacle. And there was only one way into the tabernacle. There was only one door. This was where God dwelt. There was no back door. There was no fire escape. This probably didn't comply with health and safety regulations. There was only one entrance into the tabernacle. And throughout the Psalms, this concept of God leading them through the wilderness was God leading them like a flock. Psalm 77 right through to chapter 80 has connections in it with God looking after his people like a flock through the wilderness. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Psalm 77 verse 20. Psalm 78 verse 52. He led his people out like a sheep. He guided them like a flock in the wilderness. Psalm 78 verse 53. He led them to safety and they were not afraid. Psalm 79 verse 13. We, your people, the sheep of your pasture, will thank you forever and declare your praise from generation to generation. Psalm 80 verse 1. Listen, O shepherd of Israel, he who leads Joseph like a flock. So this concept of the tabernacle moving through the wilderness was the sheepcote. It was the place where the flock would go and be protected. It was where God dwelt. But you had only one way in through that tabernacle. And at the door of the tabernacle were always the gatekeepers. And the gatekeepers of the tabernacle were the priests and the Levites. They controlled who went in and who went out. Our chapter this morning we read in Chronicles about the overthrow of a regime, of Athaliah and a regime, was all about the setting of the gatekeepers at the tabernacle. When they overthrew the regime, it was the gatekeepers who were going to control who went in and who went out based on the fact of whether they were clean or whether they were unclean or whether they threatened the king, Jehoiada. And so you had this whole picture. In fact, if you went through that chapter and now looked at the phrase gatekeeper, you'll find it appearing over and over and over again. These were the gatekeepers of the temple. It's not the first time this imagery has been seen. So bear with me on this, because we're going to bring this all together. But the Garden of Eden was set up in the same way as the tabernacle, with only one entrance. You went into the Garden of Eden by one way. Remember, Adam and Eve were sent out of the Garden of Eden, and God placed gatekeepers at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. So this was the symbol of the tabernacle. You had that which was in the most holy place, which was in the midst of the garden, the tree of life. You had the garden itself, which was like the holy place, and that was separated when Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden into the land of Eden. And God protected that way by putting the cherubim there. And then, of course, outside the land of Eden was the place where Cain was exiled to. So this was all a picture, but these were God's gatekeepers at the Garden of Eden. So Adam and Eve are kicked out, exiled out of Eden, and now there's protection put there at the door, the gatekeeper of the Garden of Eden. So now with that little background, let's come back to John chapter 10 and see something, I think, which is amazing in this story. And perhaps you haven't seen this before, because I hadn't seen it in this way before. If we take out the chapter break, and it very much appears that the events of John chapter 10 happened immediately after the events of John chapter 9. And you'll know the story in John chapter 9. John chapter 9 is about Jesus healing a man who's born blind. It's where Jesus uses the phrase, "I am the light of the world." So Jesus heals a man who's been born blind, and then this man who sees for the first time in his life is able to go up to the temple. Never been allowed to go up to the temple because he is disabled. He is handicapped. No one who was handicapped, who was lame or blind, or had blemishes, were able to bring offerings into the tabernacle. And the blind were not allowed to do this. This man on the first day, he's actually allowed to go and worship at synagogue service and go into the temple. On the first day that he's ever able to do this, he's going to be disfellowshipped. He is going to be exiled and kicked out. And the story, of course, in John chapter 9 is when he makes this incredible confession about a man who he has not seen. He has never seen Jesus in his life. He has only ever heard a voice. He heard a voice tell him to go and wash at the pool of Siloam. And he obeyed that voice, and he went and did as that voice said. And then he came and he testified before the religious leaders, the gatekeepers. The gatekeepers of the day interrogated him at the gate as to how he was suddenly now whole and restored and not unclean. And he explained to them that it's Jesus that did this. And they said, "You are unclean now because of what you've said," and they kicked him out. Isn't that the absolute, complete, ironic situation? That a man who has been in his life unclean is banished and kicked out. And they answered and said, "You were born in your sin. Will you teach us?" And they cast him out of the synagogue. And so he's disfellowshipped. And then it says immediately, and verse 35, when Jesus heard that they had cast him out, he found him. He went and found him, looked for that blind man. And he said to him, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And this is the essence of what faith is. Do you believe in the Son of Man? That's what faith is. To have belief that Jesus is the Christ and to confess with your mouth that he is the Christ. That's what fellowship with God is all about. Do you believe he's the Son of Man? And he said, "Who is he, Lord, that I might believe him?" And Jesus says, "You've seen him. You've seen him." This man has never seen anybody in his life. He was born blind. Jesus says, "You've seen him. You know." And it's he which speaks to you. And he says, "Lord, I believe." And he worshipped him. Do you know that word cast out? The Greek word. Do you know the next time it appears? John chapter 10, verse 4. The very next time this very same word of the blind man appears, and you may never have seen this in the record, is when Jesus turns around and says in verse 4, "Of the good shepherd, the sheep hear his voice. When he calls his own sheep by name, he leads them out. And when he has brought out his own," literally, the Greek word "brought out his own," ekbalo, means to expel or to eject. So here's something interesting in this story. Have you noticed in this parable, the shepherd is not bringing the sheep into the sheepfold. He is rescuing the sheep out of the fold. He is going into the fold and getting the sheep out. And he uses exactly the same word as the blind man who is expelled from the synagogue. He expels the sheep out of the sheepfold. What's Jesus doing here? See, there's this remarkable thing about doors as well, is when you consider putting a door in a public place, like the temple, the main consideration of a door in any public place is what they call accessible design. And you have to consider building a door that has accessible design. And so fire exits have to be able to have push exits in a public place so that when there's panic, people can get out quickly. But public entrances for accessible design must consider those with special needs, those with disabilities, those that might require a wheelchair, those that might require a walking stick so that they don't have a big step or a sill that's too high, those that might be visually impaired or might be blind. And so there's a lot of consideration that goes on in making a doorway to have accessible design so that those with disabilities can have access into a public place. And interestingly enough, this is the story nowadays of how they are considering public entrances for blind people. and how blind people can now use digital locks by feeling the lock and the codes. So there's a lot of consideration for access ways, for accessible design for the blind or impaired. Jesus said to them, anyone that has come up another way into the sheepfold is a thief or a robber. And in Matthew chapter 21, Jesus said to them, it is written, my Father's house shall be made a house of prayer, but you have made this entire house a den of robbers. The house had become a den of robbers. And just like in our first reading, Jesus has come for a regime overthrow. This is going to be Jesus walking into the Jewish community and society that existed, and he's going to overthrow that system, just like in the story of Athaliah and the anointing or the bringing in of Jehoiada as the king. They've made it a den of robbers. You know what the next verse is in Matthew chapter 21? I find this incredible. And some of the blind people and the crippled came to Jesus in the temple and he healed them. That's the very next verse. Isn't that amazing? Straight after it says, you've made my Father's house a den of robbers, then it says, and then the blind and the crippled came to Jesus. Accessible design. I am the door. I am the way, said Jesus. So the problem with security, there's two forms of security doors you can get. So you either make a security door which is there to keep people out. So we supply security doors to keep people safe in their home, to keep people out. But then there's another type of security door which is to keep people in. That door tends to have a whole lot more security involved within it. So, you know, the prison doors are the ones that are far more secure because they lock people up. The law was designed to be a security door for protection for the children of Israel. It was like the gates of a school to protect the children while they were educated. That's what it says in Galatians. But before faith come, we were kept in ward under the law, shut up by faith, which would afterwards be revealed. So the law became our tutor to bring us to Christ. But what happened? Instead of being a place for education, it became a place of imprisonment. And the law itself became a trap for people. And it was controlled over by wicked gatekeepers. So Jesus comes in and he's taking people out. He's going to proclaim liberty to those that are captive, to those that are bound, the opening of eyes to them that are blind, freedom to come out. It's the truest picture of accessible design. Final thing that I wanted to consider before the emblems in this principle of Jesus being the door is the cost of admission. Wherever you go, of course, when you go to the door of public establishments or things where events happen, there is a cost to admission. There was always a cost to admission into the temple. You could never come empty-handed. You had to bring your lamb, you had to bring your turtle doves, you had to bring your meal offerings. You couldn't come into the house of God without a price. And the admission prices changed. And of course, typically, at the doors, there's always places of admission prices. And people tend to take advantage of people that have desperate needs when they go to these places. I mean, who's really going to want to line up at that door and pay $8 to use a toilet? Well, if you're desperate enough, you're going to pay $8 to use a toilet, aren't you? And that's what happened under the law. They exploited people that were desperate. They exploited the sufferings of those that needed the most. And so they had made, Jesus said, my Father's house a den of thieves. There's one more door to be remembered when we think about the concept of the door in the sheepfold. There's the door of the tabernacle. There's the door back to the Garden of Eden, which I believe this is talking about. Jesus is taking them back. Adam and Eve were expelled out of the garden. Jesus is now bringing them back through the door. There's one more door, isn't there? There's this door. That door has an admission fee written on the door. The admission fee is on the lintel of the door. That's the cost of admission. And John chapter 10 goes on to say, I am the good shepherd, and I lay down my life for the sheep. We have nothing we can bring. We don't have anything we can offer. That's what the psalm says. Sacrifice and offerings thou wouldst not. To this man will I look, to him that is of a humble and contrite spirit and trembles at my word. The only thing we can bring is what the blind man brings. To be able to say, he is the Son of God. Lord, you are the Son of God. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God, and I believe. That's the price. That's the price of admission. And Jesus says, to him that comes unto me, I will in no wise cast out. But finally, Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3, Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7, to the angel of the ecclesia of Philadelphia write, the words of the Holy One, the true One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one will open. I know your works. Behold, I have set before you an open door. Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.